You are watching something most people were told could never happen. You are watching Donald Trump lose a trade war that he personally launched, escalated, and publicly bragged about. And not just lose it quietly behind closed doors, but lose it in real time, on the global stage, to a country one-tenth the size of the United States. A country Trump thought he could bully into submission with threats, insults, and tariffs. The consequences of this loss won't be abstract. They won't stay in diplomatic cables or policy papers. They are going to show up in your gas prices, your grocery bills, your car payments, and your job security. And the worst part for Trump? He can't stop it anymore. Let me show you what's really happening. Right now, most mainstream coverage is obsessing over Trump's latest Truth Social posts, threats of 100% tariffs on Canada, 50% duties on aircraft, bizarre claims about decertifying planes built north of the border, and his increasingly personal insults aimed at Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney. The media treats this like political theater, like noise, like another Trump tantrum. That's a mistake, because the real story isn't what Trump is threatening. The real story is what Mark Carney already did, and how Trump has no effective response to it. On January 20th, 2026, Mark Carney stood on a stage in Davos, Switzerland at the World Economic Forum. The audience wasn't made up of voters or cable news pundits. It was global finance ministers, central bankers, CEOs, and heads of state. And Carney delivered a message that landed like a controlled demolition. He said something simple, almost obvious, but devastating if you understand power. Middle powers must act together, because if you are not at the table, you are on the menu. Trump was at Davos. He heard it. And within 72 hours, the retaliation began. Canada was disinvited from Trump's so-called Board of Peace. Trump threatened 100% tariffs on all Canadian goods. He floated 50% tariffs on aircraft. And then he crossed a line that wasn't economic. It was symbolic. He began referring to Carney as governor, not prime minister. A deliberate insult implying Canada should be America's 51st state. This wasn't negotiation. This was intimidation. But here's where Trump made his first fatal mistake. Carney didn't flinch. When Trump declared, "Canada lives because of the United States," Carney fired back immediately. "Canada doesn't live because of the United States. Canada thrives because we are Canadian." Then Carney went on national television and called Trump's tariff threats exactly what they were: bluster. That alone would have been embarrassing for Trump, but then Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent tried to clean it up, claiming Carney had privately walked back his Davos remarks in a phone call with Trump. Carney responded the next morning, on camera. "I want to be absolutely clear. I said this to the president. I meant what I said in Davos." That moment mattered, because a foreign leader had just publicly contradicted the President of the United States and backed it up with facts. Trump wasn't just challenged, he was exposed. Now, a lot of people hear this and think, okay, but Canada is small. Trump can crush them with tariffs. This is just political posturing. That assumption is exactly what Trump is counting on. So let's talk numbers, real ones. The United States and Canada trade roughly $1.9 billion worth of goods and services every single day. Every day. That's about $91 billion per year moving back and forth across the border. Canada is the single largest export destination for American goods, purchasing $349 billion worth of U.S. products in 2024 alone. 34 U.S. states sell more goods to Canada than to any other country on Earth. Not China, not Mexico, Canada. Canada supplies 63% of all crude oil imported into the United States, about 4.1 million barrels per day. If Trump imposed 100% tariffs on Canadian energy, gas prices in the U.S. wouldn't rise eventually. They'd spike within weeks, possibly days. The American auto industry depends on Canadian steel, aluminum, and auto parts worth more than $100 billion annually. You cannot replace that supply chain quickly. You cannot reroute it painlessly. If Trump actually followed through, auto production would grind to a halt. So when Trump threatens 100% tariffs, he's not threatening Canada. He's threatening American consumers, American manufacturers, and American workers. And Carney knows it. That's why he isn't backing down. But tariffs are only the surface story. What really matters is what happened next. On January 16th, 2026, 4 days before Davos, Carney traveled to Beijing, and despite explicit warnings from Trump not to do it, he signed a trade deal with China. Under this agreement, Canada agreed to allow 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles per year into the Canadian market at a reduced tariff rate of 6.1%, down from the 100% tariff Canada had imposed in 2024. In exchange, China dropped retaliatory tariffs on Canadian canola, lowered rates to 15% by March 1, 2026, and removed anti-dumping tariffs on Canadian canola meal, lobster, crab, and peas. This reopened more than $7 billion in export markets for Canadian farmers, ranchers, and fishermen. And here's the twist. When the deal was first announced, Trump praised it. He told reporters, "That's what he should be doing. If you can get a deal with China, you should do that." 5 days later, Trump reversed himself and threatened 100% tariffs if Canada made a deal with China. Canada had already made the deal. So what changed? Davos changed. Trump suddenly realized Carney wasn't just making a trade deal. He was building an alternative system, one where Canada didn't need American approval to survive. And that terrified him. Since then, Carney has announced trade talks with India, ASEAN, and the South American trade bloc Mercosur. He has publicly bragged to Trump about striking 12 new trade negotiations across 4 continents in 6 months. These aren't vague intentions. These are active, ongoing talks. Trump's response has been predictable. More insults, more threats, more Truth Social posts claiming China is taking over Canada. But here's the problem. Trump has already played his strongest card, and it didn't work. Let me explain why Trump can't actually do what he's threatening. The USMCA, Trump's own trade agreement, explicitly protects most Canadian goods from tariffs. As of mid-2025, over 85% of US-Canada trade remained tariff-free under USMCA rules. To impose 100% tariffs across the board, Trump would have to violate the agreement he negotiated and signed. He already tried. February 2025 began with a shockwave. Donald Trump, wielding emergency powers, slapped a 25% tariff on Canadian goods. The move was swift, unilateral, and unmistakable. Across the border, Canadian officials watched as billions of dollars of exports suddenly faced a wall of cost. This wasn't a policy tweak, it was a declaration of economic conflict. Canada didn't wait. Retaliation was immediate and forceful. Tariffs on $30 billion worth of U.S. imports hit hard. The message was crystal clear. If Washington attacked, Ottawa would fight back. It wasn't just numbers on a spreadsheet. For Canadian businesses, for workers, for families depending on those factories, the tariffs were real, tangible, and threatening. By March, the consequences hit Washington like a hammer. U.S. companies revolted. Manufacturing costs surged, squeezing profit margins. Supply chains, finely tuned for decades, began to creak under pressure. Delays, shortages, and skyrocketing prices became the new normal. American firms realized the economic damage was far worse than anticipated. Exports to the U.S. plummeted. Plants slowed. Workers waited nervously as executives scrambled to keep operations afloat. Even Trump had to adjust. By March, he carved out exemptions for USMCA-compliant goods. It was a concession born of necessity, not goodwill. The economy had begun to show cracks, and he knew it. But the reprieve was temporary. The underlying tension remained, simmering beneath the surface, waiting for the next spark. August arrived, and with it, escalation. Tariffs were raised again, this time on non-USMCA goods. The damage repeated itself with ruthless predictability. Supply chains buckled once more. Prices surged. Canadian exports to the U.S. fell sharply, and American companies once again bore the brunt of the fallout. Frustration boiled over in boardrooms, and investors grew wary. The cycle of retaliation and economic pain had become painfully familiar. And then came the threats. Trump hinted at doing it again, signaling new waves of tariffs looming over the border. But by now, the markets, the companies, and even Canadian officials had learned to read the play. Everyone knew it was a bluff. The credibility of the threats had eroded. The initial shock factor had faded. Strategic bluster had replaced strategy. Even Mark Carney, once cautious in his assessments, could see through it. Analysts and executives alike started treating the warnings as theater, political noise with little real-world follow-through. Yet, despite the predictions, the tension lingered. The possibility of sudden escalation, even if unlikely, kept everyone on edge. Uncertainty is a weapon all its own, and Trump wielded it skillfully. Then, in a move that caught few off guard but still drew attention, he escalated again, this time targeting Canadian aircraft. The stakes were no longer limited to steel, aluminum, or consumer goods. Entire sectors critical to international trade and technological leadership were suddenly in play. The ripple effects were immediate. Orders slowed, contracts were reevaluated, and CEOs ran scenarios in real time, trying to measure the fallout of yet another strike. Through it all, a pattern emerged. The back and forth of tariffs had evolved into a game of perception. Initial shock had given way to resilience, strategic maneuvering, and careful calculation. Companies adapted, communities braced, and governments plotted countermoves. Yet the tension never fully dissipated. Each new announcement, each hint of escalation, reminded everyone that the economic battlefield was unpredictable, and the consequences could be far-reaching. This wasn't just a trade dispute, it had become a theater of power, bluff, and brinkmanship. Canada had learned to retaliate. The U.S. had shown it could escalate. And in between, businesses, investors, and workers were caught in the crossfire, forced to navigate a high-stakes environment where every decision mattered. January 30th, 2026 arrived with the usual chaos. But this time, the target was sky-high. Donald Trump announced he would decertify all Canadian aircraft unless Canada immediately certified American-made jets. He doubled down with threats of 50% tariffs on Canadian aircraft sales. The words sounded decisive, aggressive, and alarming. But beneath the bravado, reality had a very different story. Almost immediately, industry experts, regulators, and aviation insiders cringed. Trump had just revealed, in the most public way possible, that he had no idea how aviation works. More than half of Bombardier's global fleet, roughly 5,200 planes, already operated in U.S. airspace. These jets were not just flying, they were fully FAA certified. They met every safety standard, passed every inspection, and carried thousands of passengers daily. The president's so-called decertification was legally impossible. Planes already certified and in operation cannot simply be decertified by an executive order, period. Even the White House had to scramble. Spokespeople walked back the claim, trying to untangle the legal impossibility from the political theater. In Washington, confusion rippled across departments. Aviation lawyers muttered to one another. Regulatory agencies braced for phone calls, media requests, and the inevitable questions from concerned corporate clients. What Trump actually threatened, if it was a threat at all, remained a murky blur. Yet the consequences, whether intended or not, were tangible and immediate. Grounding nearly 1,000 private jets, planes used by corporations and wealthy individuals, would have triggered a firestorm of backlash. Boards of directors held emergency meetings. CEOs and investors calculated the impact. Travel schedules, corporate operations, and multi-million-dollar deals could be disrupted in a single stroke. The financial stakes were enormous, and the human cost was impossible to ignore. Bombardier directly employed roughly 3,000 people in the United States. Engineers, technicians, pilots, and administrative staff all faced potential uncertainty. Aviation unions were quick to speak out, warning that Trump's threats could destroy American jobs. The irony wasn't lost. A policy aimed at punishing Canada might have ended up hammering the American workforce it claimed to protect. Communities tied to aviation felt the tension immediately. Cities with bombardier facilities, employees, and their families braced for uncertainty. Contractors, suppliers, and maintenance crews realized that any disruption could cascade through local economies. Small businesses dependent on corporate flight operations suddenly faced potential upheaval. What started as political theater had become an economic gamble with real-world stakes. Analysts pored over the legal framework, shaking their heads at the disconnect between threat and reality. The FAA certification process, international aviation treaties, and commercial airline contracts all made Trump's claim untenable. Yet the headlines had already spread, spooking investors and rattling the market. The mere suggestion of grounding planes created anxiety. In the world of high finance and aviation, perception often carries as much weight as reality. Trump's announcement was a mix of bluster, misunderstanding, and theater, but its ripple effects were immediate. Markets, unions, corporations, and workers all had to navigate the fallout. What might have seemed absurd from a legal standpoint became urgent in practice. Boardrooms buzzed, labor leaders met in emergency sessions, supply chains recalculated. The aviation industry, complex and tightly regulated, had been thrown into a storm of uncertainty. By the end of the day, one thing was clear. This was no ordinary political statement. Even impossible threats can ripple through economies, disrupt communities, and touch real people. Bombardier, its employees, and American corporations were caught in the crossfire of a high-stakes drama that combined politics, economics, and sheer spectacle. In the battle over tariffs and trade, the sky itself had become a battleground. Trump was threatening Americans to punish Canada. Carney's response? Calm, professional. He reminded everyone that aircraft certification is a safety issue, not a political weapon. No panic, no concessions. That's the pattern. Every time Trump escalates, Carney expands Canada's alternatives. Every time Trump insults Canada's sovereignty, Carney doubles down on independence. And every time Trump backs down, as he always does, he looks weaker. Trade analysts even have a nickname for this now. Taco. Trump always chickens out. It's funny until you realize how serious it is. Trump's entire negotiating strategy depends on threats he can't enforce, and Carney has shown the world how to call that bluff. Now here's why this matters to you. The USMCA is up for mandatory review in July 2026, just months away. Trump wants to renegotiate everything. He wants to limit Canada's ability to trade with China. He wants to force economic submission. Carney has made it clear that won't happen. If Trump pushes too far, Canada will walk away from the table with alternatives already in place. And if that happens, other countries will follow. India, ASEAN, South America, even Europe. Trump thinks tariffs are leverage. In reality, he's teaching the world how to live without America. And once that lesson is learned, it can't be unlearned. Here's what you need to watch next. The next moves in this high-stakes game aren't happening on trading floors or in Washington boardrooms alone. They're happening across continents. Canada has already begun quietly pivoting its trade strategy, looking to India, ASEAN nations, and other emerging markets. Every negotiation, every handshake, every new deal is a signal. Ottawa is diversifying. The U.S. no longer has the same leverage it once assumed. Meanwhile, Trump's rhetoric is escalating, but not with the precision of policy. He's losing control of the narrative. What began as aggressive posturing is starting to look like desperation. Tweets, speeches, and interviews bounce between threats and bluster, but the audience is no longer captivated. Business groups, unions, and investors are starting to push back publicly. The very industries Trump claimed to protect, steel, aluminum, aviation, energy, are now vocal about the damage the tariffs inflict. That pushback chips away at the facade of unilateral strength. And then there's the pulse of the everyday economy. Gas prices. Energy is the real battlefield. Should Trump actually target Canadian oil or natural gas exports, the consequences would be immediate, personal, and explosive. Americans would feel it at the pump, families would notice, businesses would notice, politicians would notice. Any attempt to weaponize energy against Canada could backfire overnight, collapsing the entire strategy before it ever gained traction. Because here's the truth. This was never really about trade. It was about power, about the belief that America's position at the top of the global economy meant it could dictate terms without consequence. Trump assumed that Canada and the world would bend under pressure. That assumption was flawed, and Mark Carney just proved it. Carney's subtle but decisive interventions have shifted the game. The world is watching how a smaller player, a country often dismissed in U.S. political calculations, can hold its ground. It's a lesson in leverage, strategy, and resilience. And it's spreading faster than any tariff or threat could. Trump wanted to make America great again. But the reality on the ground tells a different story. Each escalation, each threat, each high-profile blunder is teaching other nations and U.S. allies that America can be resisted. Markets adjust, governments adapt, companies recalibrate. The illusion of invincibility is fading. For U.S. businesses and citizens, the lesson is immediate and practical. Resilience and diversification are no longer abstract concepts. They are survival strategies. Supply chains, energy sources, and trade partners all matter more than political bluster. The same forces that Trump tried to control, the flow of goods, energy, and capital, cannot be frozen by rhetoric alone. In Canada, the response has been methodical and strategic. While the U.S. spins in political spectacle, Ottawa quietly strengthens its international partnerships. Every deal, every export agreement, every market opened abroad erodes the supposed leverage Washington once held. The world is learning that power is not given. It is earned, defended, and executed with precision. And for the rest of the globe, the message is unmistakable. Resistance works. Even the largest, loudest economic power cannot bend everyone to its will. The lesson is moving quickly, and its impact is already visible. Policy missteps, overreach, and misjudged threats are being countered with strategy, patience, and calculated responses. In the end, Trump's strategy, rooted in the belief that fear equals control, is unraveling. America's allies, trading partners, and even domestic industries are learning how to respond when power is misused. And Carney's subtle proof that no one, not even the self-proclaimed indispensable nation, is untouchable. The world is watching. The lesson is clear. And the consequences, they're unfolding fast.